Hi there. I just want to have a short word about the topic of creativity and mental illness. In history, there have been many creators that have not been, by society standards, particularly normal or particularly stable. From Vincent van Gogh in the painting, the artist, the Dutch artist, Sylvia Plath, who was a poet, and many others. The list goes on and on. And you will read in your readings that there's really two sides to this story. I mean, some people refute the fact that creativity is in any way related to mental instability. However, that's difficult really when you look at the evidence to fully support. There is a big book that most medics have on their shelves called the DSM, and the DSM-5. The DSM is kind of a shopping list of mental disorders that insurance companies will pay for. They don't call it that, of course, but that's basically what it is. And the DSM edition 5, I think they may be up to 6 or even 7 by now. The DSM-5 does actually cite periods of heightened creativity as one of the symptoms of bipolar syndrome. So there is sort of a clinical relationship between instability of various. I use the word instability because obviously bipolar syndrome is not the only disorder, and it's not the only disorder that shows up related to creativity. Now, as an offspring from a well-known artist in the form of my father, my mother was the youngest ever student to go into one of Britain's top art universities. My sister's a professional artist. My first job in the real world was as a graphics artist for a magazine company. So, you know, I'm sort of have been surrounded by artists for quite a long time. And I would vouch for the fact that most of us, anyway, are moderately stable, and we fit moderately well into the normal world. However, not all aspects of what we do would be considered terribly sort of normal, but nonetheless, that's true of everybody, I think. I want to comment on this a little bit further. And the fact, of course, that one thing is related to another, if you like, mental instability, creativity, does not in fact mean that one thing caused the other, right? There could be an external cause which in fact impacts both of those things. And that's really what I want to focus on right now, because if you remember details from our group affiliation model, where we're saying creativity on the one side, tendency towards group activities and being in groups, being attracted to groups, is on the other side. And that, so this side's kind of being a loner, this side's kind of being very group oriented. And that pushing towards the loner will tend to heighten creativity under this model. And one of the reasons for that is quite simply that being in a group, being a high degree of cohesion in a group, will tend to cause people to not offend others in that group. And whilst we don't think of creativity as being overtly offensive, in a sense it is, because it is doing things differently from other people, and therefore thinking about things in a different way to other people. And those things tend to be shunned by groups. I hope that makes sense. So sometimes these things seem a little bit extreme, but the fact of the matter is that creativity is a very elusive phenomenon. We can take creative people, change something in their environment, and they can just flatline on the creative front. So it's a very elusive phenomenon. So we have to look at all these little possibilities. So what I'm getting at here is that a lot of the people who have bibliographically been defined as having a mental issue, and also being recognized as being highly creative. And a way above average number of those people statistically tend to be loners. They tend to operate very much on their own, and if they are with other people, it is often as an outsider looking in. You'll see this from the literature from some of the people who have committed suicide or been institutionalized because of mental problems, and yet also been world-renowned creators of say literature or poetry or whatever. So obviously within sort of society you always got these kind of bell curves where, you know, the majority of people fit into groups, into societies. They obey the social norms, if you like. And then you'll have, you know, people who have an extreme need for the company of others, and you'll have people who have an extreme need for their own company and or isolation to some degree. And this is where we're going to find our creative people, because, as I say, having loose ties to groups means that you're more able to think independently. And so if we take that then to an extreme, what we could say is that creatives have a tendency to be in this area where they are not necessarily totally outside society, but have very loose links to society. And there are other groups of people other than creatives who tend to be in this group. My family has always suffered quite extreme forms of deafness, and I can tell you that there is a statistically high percentage of deaf people who have social problems, who have mental problems related to the fact that it's very difficult to feel a part of normal society in any close sense if you're very deaf. And you know, it starts at school. You tend, when I was at school, in my early days at school, people thought I was pretty dim because half the time I wasn't really hearing what they were saying. So I was either unable to respond, or I responded in, if asked a question, I'd answer a question that was totally different because I misheard. So for all sorts of different reasons, from a very early age, being deaf tends to alienate you from groups. And deaf people, in fact, do have a much higher tendency to have mental problems, mental illness than people in the mainstream of society. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that bear in mind when you're doing these readings and when you're thinking about it, that there is one very real possibility. And that possibility is that being creative and also being in sort of one of these little tails of our social bell curve will tend to mean that you are more isolated from mainstream society. And for that phrase, you could substitute the word alienated. And people that are alienated or have difficulty fitting into mainstream society will often have a tendency to have some degree of mental instability. So that's one very real possibility in terms of how we look at the relationship between creativity and mental issues. There are, of course, other possibilities. There are physiological possibilities too, but they are sort of much more remote and have not really been backed up by evidence. I mean, specific individuals may have specific problems, specific things that cause them to have mental problems that may be nothing to do with creativity. And then, having been slightly isolated by having a mental disease, they may find themselves actually having a higher tendency to be creative, because being on their own, they have to find some sort of rewarding outlet, and that rewarding outlet may be something creative. So bear in mind, the second point I just want to emphasize there is that bear in mind when you're thinking about relationships between two different phenomena that seem to track together, that cause and effect are sometimes very difficult to establish. So I've just mentioned two possibilities. One is that sort of social isolation might cause people to be creative, and in the sense of somebody that is, and I'm thinking of a particular clinical example of somebody who was in a very severe accident, and that affected how they were able to relate to other people, who became an exceptional artist, painter, in a very short space of time, and that was the outlet for that balanced the fact that suddenly they found themselves to be isolated. And then the previous possibility was the notion that somehow, because you're isolated, maybe because that's the way you're brought up, in a very sort of isolated way, so you got used to it, thus you had weaker connections with mainstream society, thus it was easier for you to think independently, think along different lines to everybody else. And that, I mean, a lot of creative people that I know don't really think of themselves as being terribly special or even terribly creative. They just do what they do. Other people in society say, wow, that's different, I like it. And the fact that they've done something different is something that the rest of society might tend to think of as being highly creative. So anyway, I hope that's food for thought, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.